It's really great to be here with all of you. Laurel Hamilton once said that some wounds are never seen on the body, but they're felt more deeply and a more hurtful way than anything that bleeds. This is trauma. Trauma is an event or series of events that has an impact and changes a person's life. It changes them physically, emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even spiritually. It's something that happens that is beyond our ability to cope. And it actually changes the brain. Sadly, trauma is very common. There was a study done in the US by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, a health insurance company on the West Coast, that took a look at 17,000 people and studied their health over time and had them complete something called an ACE score. An ACE is an adverse childhood experience. It's not something like losing a basketball game or getting a B- on a test. It's more significant. It's having a parent incarcerated, being in a household where parents get divorced, where there's domestic violence, abuse, neglect, where someone has a mental health disorder. And shockingly, over 60% of the population have at least one ACE score. So what does that say for our work? It says we need to be aware of and mindful of the causes, the symptoms, and also the solutions in order to provide care to these youth and families that are affected by this. So the person on the left you'll probably recognize. The person on the right is Dr. Bruce Perry. Here's them sharing a few words about the research.
That very same sensitivity that makes you able to learn language just like that as a little infant makes you highly vulnerable to chaos, threat, inconsistency, unpredictability, violence. And so children are much more sensitive to developmental trauma than adults.
So if you're a child who's raised in a nurturing and well cared for environment, you're more likely to have a well-wired brain.
Correct.
And if you're a child who's raised in an environment of chaos, of uncertainty, of violence, of neglect, you are being wired differently. And typically in a way that makes you more vulnerable. Kids that grow up like that have much higher rates of risk for mental health problems, much higher rates of risk for doing poorly in school. For just functioning in the world.
Exactly.
Okay. So the impact is extraordinary. It changes the brain and it changes that individual's relationship with the world and those around them. And the science now supports this. So if you take a look at the MRI, on the right you have an MRI of someone who experienced significant abuse. On the left is a healthy brain. What you notice right away is the left one is much more lit up. There's a lot more brain activity. There's much more going on there. And when you look especially at the front, that's the thinking part of the brain. This area, this person has an underdeveloped cognitive area of their brain. And so that impacts them in a huge way. So there's two other areas. So the brain is pretty complex, but two things to be aware of are the amygdala, which is like the fire alarm. So that's fight, flight, or freeze. You know, we're in the forest, we see a bear, we react immediately. That's larger in individuals who have had trauma. So think about it. This is a person walking around day to day with a bigger alarm system. So they're going to be more reactive. They're going to have a harder time calming themselves down. They're going to be scanning all the time looking for danger. And so they're going to have a harder time focusing. And we see this when we work with kids and families, that these are behaviors we see on a regular basis. The other part to be aware of is the hippocampus. And that's the memory center of the brain. So it takes in information and it puts it in different places for storage and keeps some within the hippocampus. So if the memory center is impaired and actually gets smaller, which it does from trauma, that young person has a harder time learning and retaining information and growing and developing at the same rate as their peers. So they often get behind, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. So here's another look at trauma from inside the brain.
If we know how to observe it carefully, we can often see the impact trauma has on someone's body. But how does the brain process trauma? According to Dr. David Berselli, the neurological changes of trauma precede the psychological ones. And understanding how the sequence works could be a key step in the trauma survivor's healing process. Here, David Berselli gives us a view of trauma from inside the brain.
If you think of the brain in very simple ways, you've got parts of the brain like the brainstem, which help control things like blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, those autonomic things that happen. So they're not part of our consciousness. But then we have the midbrain, and this is the key place when we're talking about trauma and trauma recovery. The midbrain is where the emotional state resides. The amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, all of those we already know neurologically are radically shifted when a person is encountering a life or death threatening event. And it shifts unconsciously in us. That's what helps our heart rate to go up. That's what causes us to have an emotion that helps us to survive, etc. And then you have the cortex, where the ego basically resides, and that's our consciousness and our logic. What happens is, in general, we're in our cortex, we're doing fine, life is logical, the events are reasonable, we're able to process them. But some traumatic event comes to us, something even just like a car accident, comes to us, and automatically the brain shifts gears and goes into these more primitive parts of the brain where it generates the high heart rate, the blood pressure, generates the emotion of fear or anger or whatever helps save us from the event. And it does that automatically. We don't decide to do that. So in that sense, what's happening first is neurological changes. After those occur, then the ego says, what just happened to me? So it's not really psychological first, it's neurological. It's a living organism activating unconscious mechanisms neurophysiologically to survive the event. After the event is survived is when the ego kicks in and says, now what do I do with this? So I really believe that trauma, understood best, is understood first as a neurophysiological response to survival, which then the psyche tries to make sense of later.
Okay. So there's 3 parts of the brain to be aware of. So there's the thinking brain, the part that he referred to, that day to day, when we're in class, when we're doing our research and our work, we're in this part of our brain. That's the part that hurts when we do too much policy analysis as of late. Then you have this part of the brain, which is the oldest part of the brain. It's gator brain. It's all those automatic things that happen that he referred to. And then you have the midbrain, the limbic system. And years ago, people used to think if something happened to someone when they were really, really little, that they would just forget. That's not true, because every memory is recorded in the brain. And so you'll sometimes see people who are triggered by an event that we might not be triggered by, but somewhere in them, in their bodies, in their brain, that memory is stored and they may have a reaction to it. So it's pretty fascinating that we now have the science that shows us the evidence on MRIs that confirms what we see with the kids that we work with. And so what we do at Elmcrest is equip staff with information and an understanding of trauma so that there's compassion. It's not just that they're doing things to act out or be bad kids. They're doing this because they've had real trauma and real changes to their brains. So this is an example that's in an educational setting where this person is talking to teachers and things that they need to think about in the classroom. Because if you really think about it, there's a number of different places that trauma is going to show up in different ways. So here's one.
Hey, welcome back. Today I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes. And they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff. And they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. It's harder to really go to a learning brain. And the way I think about it, it's kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again? Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby, protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants. We're going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
All right, so we need some elephants to help us out. So the idea is calming the person down, helping them feel safe, having the environment work. Another example, when I took a mediation course, I presented on a chapter about a mediator who was doing some work in conflict-ridden area of the world, the Middle East. And she had brought women together, some who were Israeli and some were Palestinian, to bring them together to find common ground. They were tired of the fighting, they were stressed by the strife, and they wanted to work to make some positive change. And so, as an artist, she took a bodily approach to working with them. She started out by having them walk around in the space and just get comfortable. She asked them to just walk around, and when they felt like they found a place where they felt really safe, they should stay there, and then she talked with the group again. What she found was that the Israelis had gone primarily to the window, to the light areas of the room, and the Palestinians had predominantly gone to the darker areas, the corners. And so their bodies told them what they were feeling, what they had experienced, and they expressed that through movement. So there's a lot of researchers, Bruce Perry, who was in the Oprah interview, that encourages and really supports the whole notion of it's not just doing talk therapy, it's not just cognitive behavior therapy or doing skill building, but those things that access that middle part of the brain, the limbic system, are also really important too. So at Elmcrest, we have kids work with horses in equine therapy. We have therapy dogs that come and visit and interact with the kids. And if you want to see a room of kids really shift, bring in a dog, because they all just calm down. Who doesn't like to snuggle with a friendly dog? And so other kinds of things that are also really helpful are things you might not traditionally think are going to make a difference. Yoga, qigong, dance, repetitive drumming, polarity, neurofeedback, those all bypass the thinking brain and get to that emotional part of the brain. And that's where some of the healing happens. Especially in kids where trauma is really early, they may not have had the language to make sense of their trauma, and so that's especially important. That's why play therapy is also really helpful with little kids. So again, think about the prevalence of all of this. Think about how common it is. If 64% of the US population that were in the ACEs study, who are white and college educated, have trauma, think about the populations that we serve that are poor and marginalized. Their incidence of trauma is even higher, and their need for support and services is even higher. So last clip to take a look at. This clip shows and illustrates really nicely how neuroplasticity works. It's the idea that the brain can actually change. A growth mindset is one that believes that, I'm not stuck here. I can do something about this. My life can be different. My past is not my future, versus a fixed mindset that says I'm stuck. None of us need to be stuck because there is hope.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, There are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So try something with me for a moment. Go ahead and fold your hands. Notice which thumb is on top. You want to shout out? Karen? Right. Lauren? Left. All right. Whatever thumb you have on top, when you take your hands apart, put the opposite on the top. I see faces. Yeah, strange, right? That's what it's like to make change. That's what it's like to rewire your brain. Because you have to do the new thing over and over and over again until it becomes a new pattern. So when you work with people who have trauma, you might think, but I already told them this 50 times. Well, it might take 500 times. It takes repeated exposure to build those new pathways and to create those new habits. But it is possible. So the trauma-informed approach says not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. And it provides a systemic approach of support that looks at multiple areas, that provides training for staff, that goes through an organized organizational change effort so that people understand and support, so that every interaction that someone has is positive. I mean, you might think about a time where you went to a doctor's appointment and you get there and it's noisy or crowded, or you get up to the desk to go check in and some grumpy person lifts up their head and goes, "What?" and then shoves a clipboard at you. That can be really triggering for someone with trauma. And so you want to think about providing training and support for every person that you interact with. And so this has huge implications, I think, for all of us, whether you're with an NGO, an academic institution, or a community, or another type of organization. Give some thought to healthcare, taking care of seniors, community-based centers. So I wonder if you consider your own work, how might this impact your work? Has this sparked any ideas for how you provide service? Anyone want to comment? Anything? Yeah, I'll know.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit what, coming from a country that has a history of violence and generation after generation of trauma transferred.
Yeah.
What happens to these children if they aren't taught at an early age, or if you can't help them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So generational trauma is complex extended trauma over childhood is also a complex kind of trauma. And so the greater the level of complexity, the more that it's going to take to work and to provide supports and effort to bring about healing. It really sounds like there's a need for kind of a community-wide approach. Yeah. And when you think about too, like the initial event that is traumatic, two people can walk away from the same event and have very different reactions. So it's very individualized. It's really going to depend on your DNA and everything that you've experienced in your life up until then. So I would say that the solutions are complex as well to respond and to support to that person. Ideally, and this is thinking in terms of policy, we do more on the prevention side so that we don't have to fix this later. You know, if we provide education, supports to families, community-based resources, we wouldn't be in a place where we have so much trauma that needs to being addressed. So that's ultimately my hope, is that we continue to move in that direction. But I would say in the short term, recognizing that you may be interacting with someone who'll be more reactive, remaining calm as possible, even though that can be really hard. Listening is extremely important, and providing opportunities that are the kinds of things that will address the limbic system, you know, calming kinds of activities, as well as therapy and other kinds of supports. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Thanks.
Topic. So I have an experience working with children.
Okay.
So we took children from Moscow, Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and we were spending a month with them in the kind of children camp, and
Yep.
we were trying to create the atmosphere for children development. So we did arts, like sports and
Nice.
stuff. And I'm aware of the problem that many kids have trauma because of their parents. Like 50% of our kids were from the families where parents
Divorced?
divorced, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big problem.
Yeah.
So, and the educational system is not ideal, and
Right.
it causes a lot of problems. What is your opinion? How should a society change the educational systems to be at least not damaging, but
Right.
in the best case scenario, healing and really developing kids?
Yeah. I think you asked an important question, because it really is a societal issue. So it's really about having the entire system become trauma-informed, which means every person that interacts with kids is trained in how they speak to young people, that the environment creates a sense of safety, that it's stimulating for learning, but that responses are not punitive, they're supportive and encouraging. So praise is really important too. So it takes resources. You know, it takes resources and a desire to change, which I think is the biggest thing. There is a website that I can point you to. The Trauma-Informed Care Implementation Resource Center is pretty comprehensive and has a lot of video clips, information, training tools, talks about the change process. This particular one is for healthcare, but it really, if you think of any organization as a system, much of this will apply, and it'll also get you started on the web. There's really a lot of information. I think that we're still in the early stages of this. So we now have the science that backs up what we've thought for a period of time, that yes, trauma does impact kids. But now we're making small changes, I think. And I think we need to get more proactive too. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay. Questions are good.
You focused a lot on, making these kids functioning members of society.
Right.
How important is talking about that trauma for that healing process? Do these kids get re-traumatized through these conversations? Do you hold them off until they're comfortable, or can you turn them into functioning members of society without revisiting the trauma?
I think that's a good question, and I would probably defer to a clinician. And I think it's going to be a case-by-case situation, depending on the individual and the specific events that happened. There's all kinds of therapies for sexual abuse victims, victims of violence, etc. And that plan, that comprehensive plan for that person will be very individualized. Yeah. Thanks, though. Good question. What else? Yes.
One of your bullet points said don't react, response instead.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference between a reaction and a response? And can you give an example of that?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll put that slide back up too. So a reaction would be something that causes another reaction from the child. So if the child were to say, I don't want to do that, and you respond with, you have to, you're more likely to get another negative reaction. It becomes kind of a spiral that continues versus responding. You sound frustrated. Tell me about it. Do you need a break or a snack first? So it's responding in a really calm, even keel, which as adults, this is not always easy, but important. You don't want to add gas to the fire. So your response will determine often the next step. Oftentimes, kids who have been neglected or abused react because that's the only way they got any kind of attention. And so they've learned this sort of behavior. And so being there, not leaving, being present and consistent and calm starts to build a different kind of relationship and is a model for what their relationships can be going forward. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
So knowing that so many of us, we have our own traumas, but also that we're going to be working with people with trauma
right.
that we may or may not know about. How
right.
do we, as practitioners in higher ed and nonprofits, things like that, stay empathetic ourselves when these things get frustrating, or how do we stay fulfilled and also not burned out?
Yeah, that's a really good question also, Tracy. So I think that self-care is really important. So being in a place where you have something to give matters. So whatever it is that works for you, whether it's yoga or music or walking or hiking or photography, making sure that you're doing things to fuel yourself so that you're less reactive is important. Knowing what triggers you is also important too. So if you know that, hey, this particular thing just drives me crazy and I'm working on it, buddy up with someone who might be able to step in when you're able to do that and have them help and support. So it really is a process too. You know, most of us, 60-something% of us have at least one ACE in our histories. Many of us have more than that. And so looking at a situation and learning from it, if there's something that you're having reaction to, you can also do some reflection and think, what is it about that really got me? How might I respond differently the next time? We also provide training that's a curriculum from Cornell called TCI, which is Therapeutic Crisis Intervention. And so there's extensive training in how to respond. So we don't just tell them once, hey, do this. We work with our staff and do refreshers every quarter on this particular curriculum too. So that may be something else to think about is training that can help to respond to people who are maybe more reactive or having a harder time. Yeah. Yep. You're welcome. Yes.
I would like to come back to the point about the impact of trauma on the brain morphology.
Right.
Those kind of atrophy in some parts of the brain.
Yeah.
By trauma. So what I was thinking before that nervous cells doesn't regenerate naturally without thought. Is regeneration or reversing this atrophy is it possible by some behavior or exercise, and how can do this
survivor brain to the learning?
To the learning brain. So are you also asking too about the generational impact so that it's not passed down?
Not the generation, I mean the renewing, how to invert.
How to reverse.
Yeah.
How to reverse the process of trauma. So it's a comprehensive kind of thing. So it's a combination of an environment that's supportive and encouraging and helpful. It's therapeutic resources that will provide the ability to talk about things that need to be talked about or to learn new approaches, and also some of those mind-body things too that will address trauma. So it's really about a comprehensive approach that doesn't re-trigger, because any interaction can either be healing and supportive, or it can be detrimental and add to trauma. So being in an environment as much as possible where there's a consistent approach that's positive is important. So it is possible, but it also takes time. Yeah, it also takes time depending on how complex it is. And I think about right here in Syracuse, in our areas of concentrated poverty, those are areas that need those kinds of resources so that there are community spaces that are safe, so that there are supports for families, and so that there's training for parents. Yeah. All right. Other questions? Yes.
Regarding your last statement, you also helping parents.
Yes.
So my question is, what is a therapy for parents? Because you couldn't really help a child if family is not healthy
Right.
inside. So what kind of therapy you provide for them, and how could you overcome the family issues?
The family issue.
Violence.
Yeah, so in a number of cases, we have both residential and community-based work. In the community-based work, there's often work with the families as well. So the children receive their own support, and the families receive support and education in taking new approaches to stress, and in learning different ways of functioning as a family. It may be that they're doing what their parents did and their grandparents did, and if it's a generational poverty and abuse situation, for them it may seem normal, but they're learning a different way. And I think that's an area that needs continued resources and funding, right? Because it takes much more to work with an entire family unit than it does with a child. And ultimately, you need to get the child to the point where they can become a productive citizen and function well in the world and not revert back to what they grew up with. So that's the goal. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of metrics do you use to measure success?
Very good question. So that's a combination of looking at, are they going to school? Are they doing well in school where they used to fail? There's also psychological metrics, some tests that they take. There's also social metrics that have to do with how they're interacting with people, and that gets measured over time too. So there's a few different things that the organization looks at to see, hey, are we seeing positive change? You'll generally get a sense of it, but if you track it, you're able to get a better sense of it. We also incorporated curriculum from Boys Town, Nebraska. You might have heard of the whole, it's really a small town that's there. So with their curriculum, there are very specific amounts of time you give praise, and you do teaching interactions, and that's all tracked. So that also gives a sense of what kind of change are we seeing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Anna.
Do you also work with the families?
Sorry?
Do you also work with the families?
Yeah, so we do have clinical people that do work with the families. My team provides the training to all the staff. So we work with all the staff, whether they're working with younger kids, older kids. We have a program for very young kids with autism on the spectrum, people with disabilities. So they're trained based on the specific needs for their role. Yeah. Yeah. Good questions. Anything else I can answer? So when you really think about all the different settings that you'll notice people and behaviors, you see it in schools, libraries, you think of healthcare centers, community-based systems, government, services, all of these places ideally will become trauma-informed. And so that's our hope, that we continue to shift in that direction, that we have this awareness of how people are impacted by trauma, but also have the tools and the resources to support them and ultimately prevent what we can in the future. Any other final questions? No? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.